Haruto was only 8 years old, a quiet boy who lived in a small seaside town in Japan. The town was peaceful. Narrow streets, old wooden houses, and the sound of waves that could be heard even from the schoolyard. While most children spent their evenings playing outside, Haruto loved being alone in his small room, where he could listen to music for hours. His grandfather had once been a music teacher before he became too old to travel. He had a collection of vinyl records that he kept neatly stacked in a wooden box. The records were old, scratched, and sometimes skipped when they played, but to Haruto each crackle and pop sounded like a heartbeat. Every evening after homework, he would sit cross-legged near the small record player, close his eyes, and listen. Sometimes he would imagine the instruments playing in front of him, the violin crying like a voice, the flute whispering like the wind, and the piano sounding like gentle rain falling on his heart. He didn't understand everything about music, but he felt it. That feeling was enough for him. Haruto's parents worked long hours at a local shop, so he often spent time with his grandfather. The old man noticed how deeply Haruto listened. "You have good ears, my boy," he would say softly, smiling through his wrinkles. Music speaks to those who listen with their hearts. Haruto didn't answer much, but his eyes sparkled whenever his grandfather spoke about music. One rainy afternoon, while helping his grandfather clean the shed, Haruto discovered something that would change his life. Covered in dust and spider webs was an old keyboard, its keys yellowed and uneven. "It's broken," his grandfather said when he saw it. It hasn't worked properly in years, but Haruto didn't care. He wiped it clean, pressed a few keys, and heard faint, shaky sounds. The instrument was far from perfect, but it made music, and that was all he needed. From that day on, Haruto spent every free moment with that old keyboard. He didn't have piano lessons and he couldn't read notes, but he began to teach himself by listening. He would play one sound, then another, trying to copy the melodies he heard from his grandfather's records. Sometimes it sounded wrong, but he kept trying until it sounded right. At night, when the rest of the house was quiet, he would sit on the floor beside the keyboard and play softly, so he wouldn't wake anyone. His small fingers moved slowly at first, then faster as he learned which keys created which feelings. When he played a happy note, he smiled. When the notes were sad, he looked out the window and watched the rain. It was like his heart could speak through the keys. His grandfather often sat nearby, pretending to read the newspaper but secretly listening. One evening, after hearing Haruto play a soft tune he had made himself, the old man said, "Haruto, music doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest." Haruto looked up and smiled shyly. He didn't know what that meant yet, but he would remember those words forever. School was a different world for Haruto. He was shy and didn't talk much in class. The other children sometimes thought he was strange because he preferred to stay indoors during lunch breaks, humming tunes instead of playing games. But Haruto didn't mind. Whenever he felt lonely, he thought about his keyboard waiting for him at home. One day, his teacher announced that there would be a school talent show. Every student could show their skill: dancing, singing, drawing, or telling jokes. The classroom buzzed with excitement. Haruto listened quietly as others talked about what they would do. Deep down, a small idea began to form. Maybe, just maybe, he could play his keyboard. That night, he told his grandfather about the talent show. The old man's eyes lit up. "You should play, Haruto. Let them hear what I hear." But Haruto hesitated. "What if they laugh at me? The keyboard sounds broken." His grandfather gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Even a broken piano can make beautiful music if the player has a kind heart." Encouraged by his grandfather's words, Haruto began to practice harder. He wanted to make something special, something that would make people feel the way he felt when he listened to music. For days, he practiced the same melody over and over again. He fixed his mistakes one note at a time, smiling whenever he got it right. But as the day of the talent show came closer, doubts began to whisper in his mind. He remembered how the other children laughed at small things. They might call his piano old or useless. Still, he didn't stop. Whenever he felt afraid, he remembered his grandfather's soft voice telling him, "Music speaks to those who listen with their hearts." Sometimes, the old man would join him, tapping the rhythm softly on the table while Haruto played. Together, they made their little home feel like a concert hall. The music floated through the house like light. By the end of that week, the once quiet boy had changed. He still didn't talk much, but his heart had found courage through his music. He didn't just love playing, he needed it. It was his secret way of telling the world who he really was. And even though he didn't know it yet, the same music that comforted him on lonely nights would soon surprise everyone, and silence an entire room full of people who once thought he had nothing to say. The school was buzzing with excitement. Posters about the annual talent day were everywhere. On the classroom walls, the notice board near the gym, even on the door of the teacher's room. Every student talked about what they would perform. Some planned to dance, others to sing, and a few prepared comedy skits. For most kids, it was just a fun day to laugh and show off. But for Haruto, it was something much deeper. He had decided. He would play the piano. Haruto had spent weeks practicing at home on his grandfather's old keyboard. It was still a little broken, but he had learned how to make it sound soft and beautiful despite the cracks and uneven tones. His grandfather had helped him polish a small melody, a tune that told a story without words. It began softly like morning rain and ended like the sound of waves touching the sand. Every day after school, Haruto would rush home, drop his bag near the door, and sit by his keyboard. His grandfather would watch from the old armchair, sometimes humming along. "Remember, Haruto," he would say, "don't try to impress anyone. Just play with your heart." Haruto nodded each time. He wasn't trying to win. He just wanted to share what he loved most. But school wasn't always kind. Haruto was quiet, and in a classroom full of loud, confident children, quietness was often mistaken for weakness. A few boys from his class liked to tease him. They called him Piano Boy and laughed when he hummed during art class. One of them, Riku, was especially fond of making jokes about Haruto's old keyboard. "Does your toy even work?" he once asked, grinning. Haruto had just smiled shyly and looked away. When Talent Day was announced, Riku overheard Haruto telling his teacher that he wanted to play the piano. The grin returned. "Oh, that'll be fun to watch," he whispered to his friends. They snickered. A week before the performance, the students got to see the stage. The piano stood at one side of the school auditorium, a big, dark, upright instrument that looked older than their grandparents. Some of its keys were chipped, and a few made strange noises when pressed. The teacher warned them, "It's been tuned once this year, but it's still a little broken, so be gentle with it." That's when Riku had an idea. "Let's make Haruto play this one," he told his friends. "Let's see if his music still works when half the keys don't." The others laughed. They didn't mean real harm. They just thought it would be funny. But they didn't understand how much Haruto loved music, or how much courage it took for him to even step on stage. The day of the performance finally arrived. The school gym was decorated with colorful paper chains and balloons. Parents filled the seats holding cameras and cheering. The smell of lunchboxes and flowers filled the air. Haruto stood backstage holding his sheet of simple notes, though he didn't really need them. His palms were sweaty and his heart raced. His grandfather had come too, sitting quietly near the back row, wearing his old beige jacket. When Haruto peeked through the curtain, he saw him smiling and giving a small nod of encouragement. That one nod gave Haruto strength. One by one, students went up to perform. A girl sang a pop song. Two friends danced with bright ribbons. A boy did a magic trick that made the crowd laugh. Every act got applause, cheers, and a few giggles. Finally, it was Haruto's turn. The teacher called his name. Next, we have Haruto Takahashi playing the piano. As he walked on stage, whispers spread through the audience. Some kids snickered softly. Riku muttered to his friend, "This is going to be good." The teacher led Haruto to the piano, the same broken one the boys had chosen. When he sat down, he noticed right away that some keys were rough and stiff. His heart sank for a moment, but then he remembered his grandfather's words. "Don't try to impress anyone. Just play with your heart." He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and placed his fingers on the keys. At first, there was laughter, soft, uncertain. One of the keys squeaked and someone whispered, "Told you it's broken." Haruto ignored them. His hands began to move slowly, carefully. The first notes were uneven, but then something changed. He found the rhythm, shaping the sound like water finding its path. His body swayed slightly as he played, his small fingers dancing gracefully across the worn-out keys. The audience grew quiet. The broken piano no longer sounded broken. In Haruto's hands it began to sing. The melody was simple but full of feeling, like a story of hope, sadness, and light all mixed together. Sadness and light all mixed together. The laughter died down, His music flowed gently like a river finding its way around stones. Each note seemed to tell a story. About rain, about loneliness, about something beautiful growing inside pain. The broken keys added a strange charm like the sound of life itself. Imperfect but real. The children who had mocked him grew quiet. Even Riku, halfway through a smirk, stopped and stared. The melody grew stronger. Haruto swayed slightly as he played, lost in his own world. He didn't care who was watching anymore. He didn't hear the whispers or the giggles. He only heard his heart speaking through the piano. The teacher's eyes glistened. The parents in the audience leaned forward, their faces softening. The old piano, once considered useless, now filled the entire auditorium with warmth and emotion. When Haruto played the final note, the sound lingered in the air, like the echo of a sigh. Then, silence. No one moved. The boy slowly lifted his hands from the keyboard and looked up. For a few seconds he thought he had failed because no one clapped. But then the applause began. First from a single parent, then from the teachers, then from everyone. It grew louder and louder until the entire hall was filled with cheers. Some students even stood up clapping hard. Riku's face had turned pale. He didn't say a word. His friends looked down, suddenly quiet. Haruto bowed again shyly. His eyes searched the crowd until he found his grandfather sitting near the back. The old man was wiping a tear from his cheek, smiling proudly. At that moment, Haruto realized something. It didn't matter who had laughed or who had doubted him. What mattered was that he had played with honesty. And somehow his music had reached every single heart in that room. The piano was still broken. But in Haruto's hands, it had become whole again. The room was silent. For a long second, no one even breathed. Haruto sat on the small wooden bench, his feet barely reaching the pedals, staring at the black and white keys in front of him. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. He could feel everyone watching him. The teachers, the parents, the students, hundreds of eyes waiting for him to either fail or shine. The old piano loomed in front of him like a challenge. Some of its keys were chipped, some uneven, and one key near the center was stuck completely. Haruto closed his eyes. He remembered the sound of the sea outside his house, the soft hum of his grandfather's voice, and the words that had guided him through every practice session. Music doesn't come from your fingers, Haruto. It comes from your heart. He took a deep breath, pressed down his first key, and a dull, buzzing note filled the hall. Someone in the audience giggled softly. Haruto heard it, but he didn't stop. He pressed another key, clearer this time. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the laughter faded. The uneven tones slowly melted into something unexpectedly beautiful. Haruto began to find the pattern. His fingers moved gently, exploring the piano like he was waking it up after a long sleep. Each sound, no matter how imperfect, became part of his song. The melody was soft at first, like the first drops of rain. Then it grew stronger, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The audience could feel it. The broken piano wasn't broken anymore. It was alive. Haruto's small body swayed as he played. His eyes remained closed, his face calm. Every movement of his hands seemed to come from deep inside him. The melody carried warmth, sadness, and hope all at once. Emotions far too big for an 8-year-old boy. Yet they flowed through him naturally. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The teacher, standing by the curtain, forgot to breathe. Parents leaned forward. Even the mischievous boys who had teased Haruto stared with wide eyes. Riku, the ringleader of the teasing, felt something strange. He didn't understand music much, but there was something about the sound that made his chest feel heavy. He looked around, but no one was laughing anymore. The soft lights of the auditorium glowed warmly on Haruto's face. The dust floating in the air shimmered like tiny stars around him. His small hands moved like waves, rising and falling with emotion. When a key stuck suddenly, he didn't stop. He shifted instantly, creating a new tune that blended perfectly. It was as if he and the piano were talking, helping each other, forgiving each other's flaws. In that moment, Haruto wasn't just playing, he was feeling. The sound that came out was not perfect, but it was real. It was honest, pure, and full of life. The audience began to feel what he felt. Some people closed their eyes. Others smiled faintly without realizing it. One of the teachers, who had once thought Haruto too shy to ever perform, wiped a tear from her cheek. The melody changed again, rising softly, like a memory. It told a story that didn't need words. The story of a quiet boy who had once been afraid to be seen, who now sat under the spotlight, turning pain into beauty. When Haruto reached the middle of his performance, something magical happened. The broken key that had refused to work earlier suddenly made a faint sound, a strange, almost ghostly tone. Instead of avoiding it, Haruto pressed it again, weaving it into the melody. It was imperfect, but it added soul. That sound, that single imperfect note, became the heart of his song. He kept playing, his hands light and graceful. His music filled every corner of the hall. The old piano, for the first time in years, sang proudly, its voice trembling but strong. At that moment, everyone forgot it was just a school event. It felt like a concert, a story told by music. The air was thick with emotion. Some people felt warmth, others felt tears forming for reasons they couldn't explain. Riku looked down at his shoes, guilt creeping into his chest. He hadn't meant to be cruel. It had just seemed funny at the time. But now, watching Haruto, he realized how wrong he had been. Haruto's grandfather, sitting quietly in the back row, felt tears fill his eyes. The boy he had once taught to play broken scales was now creating something beyond words. The music was gentle but powerful, the kind that touches the soul without needing explanation. Then came the last part of the song. Haruto slowed down, his fingers soft on the keys. The sound faded like the setting sun, gentle, glowing, peaceful. His last few notes were quiet enough that the whole room leaned in just to hear them. And then, silence. The kind of silence that feels full, not empty. The kind that carries meaning. Haruto lifted his hands slowly from the keyboard and let them rest in his lap. He didn't open his eyes right away. He was still inside the music, hearing it echo in his heart. When he finally opened them, he saw something he had never expected. Everyone was still. The students, the parents, even the teachers were frozen in awe. Then somewhere from the back came the first clap. One single pair of hands, his grandfather's, and then another. And another. Within seconds, the hall exploded in applause. It wasn't loud and wild, and it was soft, emotional, filled with respect. Many people stood up. Haruto blinked in surprise, unsure what to do. He stood, bowed politely, and smiled shyly. The same piano that everyone had laughed at had just filled the entire hall with magic, and the boy who was once teased for being quiet had spoken more beautifully than words ever could. When the last note faded, silence filled the room like a soft blanket. For a few seconds, no one dared to move. The air felt different, heavier but also lighter, as if something invisible had shifted inside everyone. The old piano, with its cracked keys and faded paint, stood proudly in the center of the stage, glowing under the warm lights. Haruto sat still, his hands resting on his lap. He could still feel the vibration of the final chord buzzing softly through the wood beneath his fingers. His heart was racing, but his face was calm. He didn't know if he had done well or made mistakes. All he knew was that he had played from his heart. At first, there was no sound, just the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the soft creak of chairs. Then a small clap came from the back of the hall. It was his grandfather, smiling, his wrinkled hands coming together slowly. That single clap broke the spell. Soon, others joined. One by one, the sound grew, gentle at first, then louder until the whole auditorium was filled with applause. Students stood. Parents clapped with tears in their eyes. Teachers looked at each other in disbelief. The boy who had walked onto the stage in silence was now surrounded by the sound of admiration and awe. But what truly changed the room wasn't just the applause. It was the feeling that lingered, a deep shared emotion that words couldn't explain. Everyone, from the smallest student to the oldest teacher, felt something stir inside them. Haruto stood up slowly and bowed, his head low, his small shoulders trembling slightly. When he looked up again, he saw faces, not laughing, not mocking, but glowing with warmth. Even Riku, the boy who had planned the cruel joke, was clapping hard, his eyes glassy with guilt and wonder. For the first time, Haruto saw something different in people's eyes: respect. He looked toward the back of the hall and saw his grandfather smiling proudly, his eyes wet but bright. The old man nodded as if to say, "You did it." Haruto smiled back, feeling tears rise in his own eyes. The teacher stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. That, she said softly into the microphone, was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever heard. The students didn't stop clapping. Some of the younger ones even shouted, "Encore! Encore!" Though Haruto didn't know what that meant, he just bowed again, embarrassed but happy. The same piano that everyone used to ignore now seemed different, like it had woken up after a long sleep. Its dull black surface looked shinier under the lights, and even the broken keys seemed to have a strange charm. People whispered, "I didn't know it could sound like that." When the show ended, parents surrounded the stage, congratulating the students. Haruto tried to slip away quietly, but his classmates gathered around him. They didn't tease him this time. Instead, they smiled. "That was amazing," one girl said shyly. Another boy nodded. "You made that piano sound alive." Even Riku stepped forward. His voice was quiet. "Hey, Haruto," he began, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't think you could actually play like that." "I'm sorry." Before Haruto blinked, unsure what to say. He gave a small smile. "It's okay," he said simply. And he meant it. Riku smiled awkwardly and held out his hand. "Friends?" Haruto hesitated, then shook it. "Friends," he said softly. The teacher, watching from the side, smiled with pride. She walked up to Haruto and gently patted his shoulder. "You reminded everyone what music is really about," she whispered. After the show, the auditorium slowly emptied. The lights dimmed and the echoes of applause faded away. But something remained. A kind of warmth, as if the music still floated in the air, hiding in the walls and the floor. The piano sat quietly on the stage, its lid half open. If someone had looked closely, they might have imagined that it too was smiling. Haruto waited near the door for his grandfather, who was talking to one of the teachers. The old man walked slowly toward him, his eyes full of pride. "You played beautifully," he said, placing a hand on Haruto's head. "You didn't just fix the piano, my boy. You fixed people's hearts." Haruto looked down, embarrassed but happy. "I just played what I felt," he said softly. "And that's what made it powerful," his grandfather replied. They walked home together under the evening sky. The air was cool, and the sound of the sea whispered in the distance. The world felt quieter, but in a good way, like everything had slowed down to listen. When they reached home, Haruto went straight to his old keyboard. It looked smaller now, but still special. He sat down and played the same melody again. Slower this time, softer. His grandfather listened from the porch. The tune floated out through the window and mixed with the sound of the waves. It was peaceful, almost magical. At that same moment back at the school, the teacher stood alone in the empty hall looking at the piano. She ran her fingers gently over the keys. The once broken notes now carried a story. The story of a little boy who had turned laughter into silence and silence into something unforgettable. That day, something inside the school changed. Students began treating each other more kindly. Teachers spoke more gently. And every time someone walked past the piano, they smiled. Because they remembered the moment when a quiet 8-year-old boy reminded everyone what true music sounded like. The last note hung in the air like a feather floating in slow motion. Haruto's fingers rested on the piano keys, still trembling slightly from the effort. The sound faded gently, echoing through the hall, bouncing off the wooden walls and finally disappearing into complete silence. For a few long moments, the silence was everything. No whispers, no laughter, not even the sound of breathing. It was the kind of silence that made you feel rather than hear. Everyone in the auditorium sat frozen, as if time itself had paused. Haruto didn't open his eyes right away. He could still hear the song playing in his mind, still feel it inside his chest like a heartbeat. His small shoulders rose and fell as he took a deep breath. When he finally lifted his head, the bright stage lights made his eyes shine. He looked out into the sea of faces. No one moved. Students, teachers, parents, all of them were staring at him, their expressions soft, their eyes glistening. Even the boys who had once mocked him looked different now. Their smiles were gone, replaced by something else. Respect, maybe even shame. For Haruto, those few seconds felt endless. He wondered if he had done something wrong. Why wasn't anyone clapping? Did they not like it? Then, from the back row, he heard the familiar sound of gentle clapping. Clap, clap, clap. It was his grandfather. The old man's eyes were filled with tears, but his face glowed with pride. His hands came together slowly, lovingly, like he was applauding not just the music but everything his grandson had become. That sound broke the stillness. A teacher began to clap next. Then a parent, then another. And suddenly, the whole room erupted into applause, a wave of sound so powerful it felt like the floor itself was alive. Haruto blinked in surprise. He stood, bowed politely, and smiled nervously. The applause grew louder. Some students stood up. A few teachers wiped their eyes. One of them said softly, "Bravo," though Haruto didn't know what that word meant. He only knew that it felt warm, like sunlight. The same people who had laughed when he first walked on stage were now cheering for him. The same piano that everyone had called broken had just sung a song that no one would forget. Riku, standing in the front row, clapped harder than anyone else. His face was red, not from laughter, but from guilt and admiration. He whispered to his friend, "I can't believe that was him." His friend just nodded quietly, too moved to answer. The applause seemed endless. Haruto's chest felt full, his eyes watery. He bowed again, this time a little deeper. The sound of clapping was like waves crashing against the shore, powerful, endless, beautiful. When it finally began to fade, Haruto stepped back from the piano. He ran his small hand across the keys gently as if saying thank you. The instrument that everyone had called broken now looked almost proud, shining softly under the lights. His teacher came up to the stage and put her hand on his shoulder. "That," she said softly, her voice trembling, "was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Haruto blushed, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he whispered. "You didn't just play a song," she continued. "You told us a story." As he walked off the stage, people reached out to pat his shoulder or say kind words. Some parents told him they hadn't cried at music in years. A few students from other classes ran up to him saying, "You're amazing." But Haruto didn't feel like a hero. He just felt peaceful, like something inside him had finally been set free. At the end of the event, when everyone was leaving, Haruto returned to the piano one last time. The hall was almost empty now, just a few teachers cleaning up decorations, and his grandfather waiting near the door. Haruto sat down quietly and pressed a single key, middle C. The note was soft, simple and pure. "That's the one," he whispered. "That's the last chord." His grandfather walked over slowly, smiling. "You found your voice, Haruto," he said gently. Haruto looked up at him. "I didn't say anything," he replied. "You didn't have to," his grandfather said. "The music spoke for you." The old man looked at the piano, then at his grandson. "That piano was broken," he said softly. "But you saw beauty where others saw damage. That's what true musicians do. They don't fix instruments and they heal hearts." Haruto smiled. "It was never broken to me," he said. They stood there for a while, the boy and the old man, watching the piano as the last rays of sunlight from the windows fell across its worn surface. When they finally walked out, the hall was empty. But if someone had walked in later, they might have sworn they heard faint music still echoing, the memory of the song that silenced laughter and filled the room with something pure and unforgettable. The next morning, when the students returned to school, everyone talked about it. Teachers replayed it in their minds. Parents told the story at dinner tables. And Riku, who once laughed, now looked at Haruto with quiet respect. Something had changed in that school, and in the center of it all stood a boy who had once been too shy to speak and now remembered as the child who made a broken piano sing. Weeks passed after the talent show, but the memory of Haruto's performance didn't fade. It stayed like a quiet echo in the halls of the school, in the whispers of students, and in the soft smile of every teacher who had watched that small boy turn a broken piano into something magical. The piano was still there on the stage. It hadn't been moved or covered up as usual. Instead, it sat proudly in the sunlight that streamed through the tall auditorium windows each morning. The scratches and chips were still visible, but somehow they didn't make it look old anymore. They made it look special. One morning, when Haruto arrived at school, he noticed something new. A small golden plaque had been fixed above the piano. It read, "Music isn't about perfection, it's about heart." Inspired by Haruto Takahashi, Class 3B, he stood there for a long time, reading those words again and again. His teacher, Mrs. Kobayashi, walked by and smiled. "You gave that piano a second life," she said softly. "Now everyone will remember what you taught us and that beauty doesn't need to be perfect." Haruto blushed and bowed slightly. "Thank you," he murmured. Blushed and bowed slightly. "Thank you," he murmured. From that day on, the piano was no longer treated like an old prop. It became a symbol, something students would look at with respect. Whenever someone passed by, they often paused, remembering the little boy who had once made it sing. Some even said the piano sounded better now. As if Haruto's music had healed it somehow, Riku and his friends changed too. They didn't tease anyone anymore. In fact, one day during recess, Riku came up to Haruto with a shy grin. "Hey," he said, scratching his head. "Do you think you could teach me a few notes?" Haruto blinked, surprised. "You want to learn piano?" Riku nodded. "Yeah, maybe I can learn that song you played. It was amazing." Haruto smiled softly. "Okay," he said. "We can start after class." That afternoon, for the first time, Haruto wasn't alone at the piano. He sat beside Riku, showing him how to press each key gently, how to feel the rhythm instead of counting it. The two boys laughed when the sound came out wrong, and for the first time they weren't enemies. They were friends. The teacher often peeked in from the door and smiled to herself. It was as if Haruto's music hadn't just changed the piano. It had changed people. At home, life felt lighter too. His grandfather often reminded him, "That day you did more than play music, Haruto. You taught the world to listen." Sometimes in the evenings, the old man would bring out his vinyl records again and they would listen together. But now Haruto would add his own melodies on top, blending past and present, the music of generations meeting in harmony. The small house by the sea was often filled with gentle sound, the soft hum of the record player, the clicking of piano keys, and the laughter of a boy who had found his voice. Months later, during a school event, a local newspaper wrote a short article about Haruto. The title read, "The Boy Who Played a Broken Piano and Taught a Town About Hope." It wasn't a big story. It didn't make him famous, but it touched everyone who read it. Some parents even brought their children to see the piano, telling them, "This is where a little boy reminded everyone that kindness makes the best music." By the end of the year, Haruto had become more confident. He still didn't talk a lot, but his silence now felt strong, not shy. When he smiled, it made people feel calm. His classmates often asked him to play during lunchtime, and even teachers would stop by to listen. One afternoon, as the final school bell rang and the students began to leave, Haruto stayed behind. The hall was empty again, quiet except for the soft creaking of wooden chairs. He walked up to the piano and ran his hand gently along the keys. A thin layer of dust had already begun to settle, but it didn't matter. He sat down, pressed a few notes, and smiled at the sound. It was slightly off-key, the same imperfect charm as before. He began to play slowly, just for himself. No audience, no stage lights, no clapping. Just music, simple and honest. As he played, the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the room golden. Dust particles floated like stars. The melody filled the air, wrapping the empty seats in warmth. Outside, the waves crashed softly as if keeping rhythm with him. When he finished, he didn't bow this time. He just sat there quietly, feeling peaceful. Then he whispered to the piano, "Thank you." He closed the lid gently and stood up. Before leaving, he looked back once more. The plaque above it gleamed faintly in the sunset. That night, when Haruto went home, he found his grandfather sitting by the porch, staring at the sea. The old man looked up and smiled. "Playing again?" he asked. Haruto nodded. "Just one last time before the holidays?" His grandfather chuckled. "I could almost hear it from here." Haruto sat beside him, the waves whispering in the distance. "Grandpa," he said softly, "do you think people will remember the music?" The old man smiled gently. "Music like yours never disappears," he said. "It stays in hearts and memories and silence. That's the echo that never fades." Haruto rested his head on his grandfather's shoulder. Together they watched the sky turn orange and gold. The wind carried the faint sound of the sea, like a song continuing far away. And even though the last note had been played, the music lived on, not just in the piano, but in every person who had heard it, every child who believed again, and every heart that learned that broken things can still create the most beautiful sound in the world.